Thanks, Evelyn. So yeah, as she mentioned, my name is Mischa Young. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto. Can you hear me in the back? Close to the mic? Okay. I have a tendency to be too close sometimes. This is definitely the coldest I've been presenting. I don't know if it's cold it seems warmer here, but in the back it's actually really cold. And this is an amalgamation of a few research projects under the umbrella theme of ride-hailing that I've been working on. It's entitled Ride-Hailing Platforms Are Shaping the Future of Mobility, But for Whom? So a bit of a background, what kind of got us going on this research was looking at ride-hailing websites and seeing how they portray themselves as mobility enablers. These are quotes taken from Uber's website. We ignite opportunity by setting the world in motion. So they clearly understand the synergies between transportation access and socioeconomic outcomes, but they perhaps don't really fully understand the equity concerns that go with that. So maybe the benefits aren't equally distributed. So that's what we want to look at. So I'm in a room of experts on this issue, transportation equity. We're all aware that transportation plays a key role in many aspects of our lives, and the lack or inability to use transportation services can be seen as a catalyst to many socioeconomic disparities. We've been building our cities around cars for at least 50 years, maybe more probably, and in doing so have made owning a car indispensable. Other modes, by unbundling the home, work, and leisure activities, have made other modes less feasible, less appealing, and ultimately less likely. There was a debate yesterday on this topic, but a lot of people faced with this discrepancy have argued in favor of subsidizing car ownership. So I won't get into that. Policymakers have to date have been reluctant to implement such policies because they, I guess, rightfully understand that that will increase automobile usage and then in turn congestion, pollution, and urban sprawl. So in this specific context, ride-hailing kind of positions itself as a potential solution to provide mobility to those who don't have cars. It enables carless individuals to reach opportunities at a lower cost than taxis and car sharing services. And it also, some proponents of this view argue that it provides better accessibility to transit users by serving as a complement to transit and a first last mile solution. So others have painted a more cynical picture of what is to come, arguing that it is a luxury service, it's prohibitively expensive, and it simply replaces mobility provided by other more sustainable modes of travel. So that's what we want to kind of get to the bottom of this, see what is the effect, is it actually a solution or not? To do that, we use the Transportation Tomorrow survey in Toronto in the Greater Golden Horseshoe area. That's the large area around Toronto. And what's interesting is that in the newest rendition of this survey, the 2016 version, they include ride-hailing as a travel mode. So this is a map here, it's hard to see in the back, but these are all the trips using their origin, destination, and shortest path, kind of mapped all the ride-hailing trips. And then we kind of look at the move to the descriptive statistics, looking at who uses ride-hailing. So what we see is that nearly half of ride-hailing users belong to households who own over $100,000. And then looking at the top yellow bar, that's kind of misleading at first because it shows that there's 12% of ride-hailing users that are in the lowest income category. But that's because in large part we had to merge the two lowest income categories for ride-hailing because there wasn't enough ride-hailing users in that lower category, the $0 to $15,000, only 2% of users. So this kind of talks to the point Aaron made, how there's a lot of barriers. There's technology barriers, so you have to have a smartphone, a data plan. There's also banking barriers, so you have to be able to have online banking systems like a credit card or debit card. There's also the problem of surge pricing. A lot of low-income users don't use ride-hailing because of the fear of surge pricing, not knowing if on the way home you'll hit a surge. A lot of people just decide or avoid to use it altogether. So ride-hailing companies are adapting. They are offering now split fare systems and car sharing options like Uber Pool and Lyft Line. And in some instances, rare occasions, it does at least position ride-hailing in the same per user cost as transit. For instance, if you're at Toronto City Hall and you're going to Billy Bishop Airport, that's a $3.25 transit ride. So if you're 4 people, that's $13, which means that by transit by Uber it can be cheaper in certain instances. We looked at all the cost or estimated the cost For all the ride-hailing trips in our sample, the mean was $15.70. That's a rough estimate using their online calculator, so it's based on the distance, duration, and a base fee, and then we accounted for surge pricing during peak periods, but it's still much more expensive than transit, so it's only in a few situations, very short trips especially, that it can be cheaper. Looking at age, we see that it's, no surprise here, it's a younger generation phenomenon. Only 6% of ride-hailing users are aged 60 and above. That's in large part because of the digital divide. A lot of older generations are not as familiar with this technology, and a lot of them said they don't trust it either, which is kind of a shame because ride-hailing does offer substantial benefits to seniors. A lot of them have just lost their ability to drive, and ride-hailing is an option to kind of gain a part of that independence. But as I mentioned, a lot of them don't trust the online banking system, or a lot of them are confused by how to actually hail rides. On the other end of this age spectrum, there's children who are also largely excluded from ride-hailing because ride-hailing companies do not permit drivers to pick up unaccompanied minors. There's been some new companies who have come up or evolved. These are companies like Zoom or Shepherd who really target children. But these have been having a hard time as well, just because there's kind of a lack of demand during school hours and a lack of supply right after and after school periods. Gender, so there's a wide body of literature research on gender and transportation that reveals how women's experience with gender-based violence and sexual harassment incidents actually limits their mobility. And this is what we were expecting to see with ride-hailing, but as you see, the results are fairly similar with ride-hailing and with all modes combined. So our hypothesis here was that there's perhaps two effects happening at once. On the one hand, there's a fear of embarking on a trip with a complete stranger. This is in large part because of all the articles we see of all these incidents with ride-hailing. But on the other side, there's also literature kind of gives another perspective showing how ride-hailing may actually be the safest alternative at night or when traveling in dangerous neighborhoods. And then I think Orly touched upon this yesterday. There's companies that are by woman, for women only. So these companies like Drive Her and Safer in the United States are similar companies, but those have been having problems too, just because by refusing to hire males or men, they contravene the American Civil Rights Act prohibiting discrimination. So they've been having a hard time as well. They're in legal battles at the moment. Disability, there's definitely strong potential to improve mobility of those with disabilities. Ride-hailing, because drivers are able to help the passengers like taxis, they offer substantial advantages. The problem is that there's not enough supply at the moment. There's not enough people who are actually willing to convert their car into a wheelchair accessible car. This is the bottom right. Yeah, it's taken from the recent City of Toronto report with U-Tree, showing how the wait time, because there's not as much supply, the wait time is much longer. So in purple, there's the wait time. We see it is roughly double the one that is for all ride-hailing modes combined. It does seem to be, the time does seem to be getting smaller, but not at the same speed as for all modes combined. Turning to the spatial distribution of trips. So it's hard to see on these little maps, but ride-hailing, these are all the origin points and then the destination points. We can really see that it's an inner city phenomenon. Over 50% of our trips in our sample are entirely within the central planning district, which is roughly the old City of Toronto limits, and 3/4 of them either begin or end in that same district. That's in large part because of drivers' ability to converge on high demand areas. They rightfully recognize that they'll make more money by going to areas with high demand, and they can, of course, convert to those areas. Ride-hailing companies as well advertise those, though. They'll advertise the hotspots on their website and kind of send text or all that to their drivers to tell them where to go to then get more money, get higher demand. But what you've probably noticed here is that that is also the areas where transit in Toronto is highest. Transit access is best. So what what that means is that because it's in areas with high transit, that might potentially marginally increase the mobility of people living in those areas, but at the same time perpetuate the transport inequalities in outer areas of the city. So people downtown have more options, whereas people living in the suburbs have less options in comparison to downtown. Looking at the modal impacts of ride hailing, so what we did, there's been a lot of studies showing how it impacts taxis. What we did was we used earlier renditions of the Transportation Tomorrow survey and compared the ridership of different modes to see how it impacted the ridership. No surprise, because ride-hailing only accounts for roughly 1% of trips. It's still too minute to actually influence the ridership of large modes like driving and transit. But then what we wanted to do is really look at transit in particular, see how it affects transit. So we kind of moved from an aggregate level to disaggregate level and looked at individual trips. So I'm going to kind of summarize the whole paper in one slide here, but what we did is we took all our ride-hailing trips, we computed their fastest transit alternatives. Then we did a sensitivity analysis and kind of found trips based on their travel time difference that we kind of considered to be a substitute. So if you had a travel time difference of less than 15 minutes, we said those were substitutes. That represented roughly 31% of trips in our sample. And trips that had a travel time difference of more than 30 minutes, we consider to be complement, because those take 30 minutes more by transit. They're much longer. They operate in areas or at times with poor transit service. That represented 27% of trips. We then ran an ordered logistic regression to see what factors influence the probability of belonging to type A, so substitutes, or type C, complement trips. And we found that the trip characteristics have a much more significant impact on the difference in travel time than person-level attributes. That was interesting. So we agree that person-level attributes like income and age definitely influence the probability of using ride-hailing, but once you've made the decision to use ride-hailing, they don't influence what kind of ride-hailing trip will take place. What influences that is more the trip-level attributes. So the location of trips was also very interesting, was we saw that the purpose of trips matters. So shopping, for instance, shopping trips are much more likely to be substitutes. We kind of imagined that was probably because if you have your hands full of bags, you don't want to be stuck in transit, you want to just take an Uber or get home. So now what? We divide our recommendations into two parts. First, we propose recommendations to minimize, so what government should and can do to minimize equity concerns. That includes regulatory taxation suggestions. We were looking at subsidizing pooled trips and removing the option for ride-hailing companies to have surge pricing on them. That would reduce the cost, and it would also reduce the variability in pricing. We do agree, however, that does not solve the technology barriers and payment requirements, but believe that those might be better resolved through price mechanisms such as income tax reductions. Then looking at the gender and racial discrimination, which I didn't even have a chance to talk about, our recommendation on that front is for governments to really revise and update their training program and impose stricter background checks. So instead of doing what has happened in Toronto, where when ride-hailing arrived, instead of updating their programs, they just sliced their programs to level the playing field with taxis. Our recommendations is not to slice it, but really to take this opportunity to reconsider how to make them a safer service. Impose minimal accessible vehicle requirements. So that was interesting. I was talking with some people at Uber yesterday, and they were saying how that might not be the most viable option on their front, and that perhaps a better option would be to have a minimal or maximal wait time that we were willing to accept. So that's another option I'm willing to look into more. Finally, from another important recommendation is to really limit the supply of ride-hailing permits. Ride-hailing remains in its very early stages. It's a very complex issue. There's still many unknowns, and assuming that a revenue-driven ride-hailing company will produce the optimal level of supply is overly optimistic. Our recommendations are the government should preemptively cap the supply of ride-hailing vehicles with the full intention of increasing that cap as we discover the impacts with time. Switching to a research side, there are still many uncertainties with regards to ride-hailing. So we kind of propose this kind of update and improvement in the data collection process. So to continue doing travel surveys, exhaustive and frequent travel surveys are important. Always having ride hailing as a separate mode. So that provides you with information on the socioeconomic characteristics of users to really kind of unpack or discover which groups are at potentially marginalized. And then we have to start partnering and collaborating with the ride-hailing companies. This is starting to happen in Toronto, which is great, but also in other cities as well, to collect data. We don't have much data on the price of ride-hailing trips, on the occurrence and timing and extent of surge pricing, and also on wait times as well. And then finally, a lot of these questions I've just talked about are especially well suited to be addressed through qualitative data collection methods. So governments have to start looking at qualitative data methods like ride-alongs and interviews, and interviewing seniors, women, minorities, and other potentially marginalized groups to understand why they use ride-hailing and why they are potentially excluded from it. And that is it. If you have any questions, please feel free.